Recording it. Yes, it is. Awesome. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Women's History Month installment of the Global Black Studies webinar series here at Western Carolina University. I first want to thank the university, thank my college, the College of Arts and Sciences, and also pay acknowledgement to the indigenous peoples of this area and say greetings and thank you for allowing us to spend time in your space here. And today we have a treat for our Women's History Month webinar. We're going to be talking about the African American women's electorate in the U.S., or as I would like to say, the Black women's electorate in the U.S., and discuss that impact, legacy, potential future trends, as well as maybe misrepresentations or misinterpretations of the Black American woman and her involvement in politics, as well as her place and involvement in society. And today we have with us Dr. Regina Moore. She's an assistant professor of political science at Alabama State University, which is a historically Black college and university in the state of Alabama. And she comes to us with excitement, insights, expertise, and enthusiasm, which we certainly love. So I first want to say thank you, Dr. Moore, for joining us. I thank you on behalf of the Global Black Studies program, as well as our students and community members here in Cullowhee, North Carolina. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much. And it is definitely a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. As Dr. Walton said, I am a professor of political science at Alabama State University in Montgomery, Alabama. If you know anything about the civil rights movement, you know that Montgomery brands itself as the birthplace of the civil rights movement, because it is the city where we had the Montgomery bus boycott. It is also the city that served as the end, so to speak, of the Selma to Montgomery march. So it is a pleasure to be here. I always love talking about politics, and I always love talking about the role of Black women in politics and the historical legacy of Black women in politics. So I'm definitely looking forward to the dialogue and the conversation this afternoon.
Awesome, awesome. And I do want to say a couple things before we get started. That Dr. Moore is my first cousin, and I love her. She's my younger cousin, but she got her PhD before I got mine. So she holds that crown in our family of the first to get that PhD, and I'm just the runner-up.
And actually, I defended my dissertation 1 year and 1 day before David. So that is the distinction between the periods in which we earned our PhDs. But yeah, we are the first PhDs in our family. We wear that with a badge of honor, and we also recognize what that means in terms of the responsibility that we have to upholding our family name and our family legacy, but also making sure that we serve as role models for our younger family members. So yes, we are definitely first cousins. Our mothers are sisters.
Indeed, indeed. So I first want to say that historically, Black women have had a great impact on at least Black politics in America, right? And I'm not trying to understate it, but I first want to establish that. So as well as in American politics in general, right? So in what ways would you say as a political scientist that Black women as a body politic, as a demographic, and as well as an electorate have impacted American politics?
So the role of the Black woman in the shaping of American politics is a legacy of both struggle and triumph, right? So when we think about the role of Black women, when we talk about politics and when we talk about voting and gaining the right to vote, so we can start there. So the 19th Amendment was passed and ratified in 1920. So it's just over 100 years ago, right? But when we think about the suffrage movement in this country in the battle and the work and the organizing that went into gaining the right to vote for women, we know that when we talk about and discuss the role of the Black woman, we have to first talk about the intersectionality of our identity. So we have to talk about what that means when we look at the push to extend access to the ballot box in this country. Black women were involved in those movements in an intersectional manner. So they were Black, but they were also women. So what did that mean for them? So in 1920, when this country ratified the 19th Amendment, while Black women had been in the trenches, organizing and pushing for the right to vote, that 19th Amendment did not extend to Black women. So that was a gain for women, but more specifically for white women. So when we talk about the right to vote, we know that Black women were granted a seat at the cultural and political table in America, but it took them much longer than it took for white women to gain that right. Black women were often overlooked in suffrage activities. They would show up for suffrage marches, but they would show up and then be asked to be at the back of the line. So they couldn't necessarily be at the forefront of those movements, but they also had to balance their battle for voting rights with their identity as their Blackness as well as their womanness. And so they had to contend with the fact that there were white women suffragists who wanted the right to vote, but these same white women would show up to marches, ask them to be at the back of the line, but these were the same women who were offended when this country had the audacity to give Black men voting protections before they extended that protection to them. So when we talk about how Black women have navigated and shaped their political identities in this country, we have to look at it through an intersectional lens and understand that race played a part in the way that they organized, their gender played a part, and what we also see throughout history is that also place would often play a role. Like, what part of this country were they, and where were they situated? Because if we move from the suffrage movement to the civil rights movement and the modern day civil rights movement, we know that a lot of the work done by Black women in this country were done by Black women, oftentimes in the South, or Black women who had a connection to the South and may have left the South during the period of the Great Migration. And we can even look here in Alabama. Let's take my hometown, for example. If we look at Lowndes County, we always have a running joke, and David, you'll get this, but the joke is that everybody in Lowndes County has a family member in Detroit.
Yes, ma'am.
That was just the natural path for Black people when they were leaving Lowndes County during the Great Migration. So when we talk about the role of women in the South, particularly like Lowndes County, was still often connected to the movements and the actions of women in northern areas, more specifically like Detroit. So when we look at politics and we look at the role that women have played in the shaping of politics, we cannot have those discussions without talking about race, gender, and oftentimes what that meant, what place meant, like where were they situated in this country.
Indeed, indeed. And that's very, very insightful. Now, in the ways that Black women began organizing at the turn of the century, right, precursor to the suffrage movement, like anti-lynching with
Mhm.
Ida B. Wells, for example. Uh, in what ways early on, even leading up and during the suffrage movement, uh, did Black women have to contend with Black patriarchy or male chauvinism as they tried to engage in political activity?
So that is the other thing that Black women had to contend with, and so when I said earlier we had to look at through an intersectional lens. Yes, they were Black, so they had a connection to the issues that impacted Blackness in the Black communities across this country, and what that meant, what particular actions meant for Black people. But there was also this balancing act of trying to fit and find their place within even like a Black movement as a woman. And so oftentimes they Black women had to kind of navigate how they even had a seat at the table in Black spaces, because um, oftentimes leadership was conceptualized in terms of Black male leadership. We saw that, as you mentioned, at the turn of the century, but we also saw that during the civil rights movement. Because if we think about even like the modern day civil rights movement, for example, the stories of Black women are often erased from the organizing efforts of the civil rights movement. And the same was true at the turn of the century, when we had Black women trying to figure out how do they organize in terms of anti lynching efforts. How are they going to organize even in terms of like going back to the suffrage movement? A lot of the times, most of that work was in terms of Black women's suffrage was left on the shoulders of Black women. They didn't have the support of white women, and they didn't necessarily have the support of Black men either.
Indeed, and that makes me think about your sorority and its genesis in many ways tied to the suffrage movement. And I'm thinking of how all of the exist in what will become 20 years later, the NPHC organizations. I see nothing on the historical record that indicates that they supported that, including my fraternity. Like none of them supported that besides your sorority. And they seem to do that in regards to representing for the women almost alone in those aspiring circles of Black upper mobility, the college educated class. And I think that's important because it highlights the various multi ways, right, that Black women found and exercised agency, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of some of these organizations, not just the NAACP or the National Council of Negro Women, but also organizations like Kappa Alpha Psi and Delta Sigma Theta and et cetera. You know, the importance of what the real history, you know, reveals. Now, many people wouldn't realize that Black women had got involved with being elected officials after the passing of the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act. So far earlier, right, than what they may realize. So I was wondering if you might want to speak a little bit towards that.
Sure. And just quickly, just to go back to your reference to Delta. So the one of the first public act for the founders of Delta Sigma Theta was to participate in a suffrage march in Washington, D.C., March 3rd, 1913, not even a full 2 months after the founding of the organization. And while all 22 founders showed up for this particular march, as I referenced earlier, this was again a time when their presence was somewhat, I wouldn't even say welcomed. It was tolerated, and it was tolerated to the extent that even they were asked to move to the back of the parade line, because they couldn't be visible necessarily on the front lines alongside the white women who were participating in that particular march. But to go back to your question about some of the early efforts for Black women to get involved in electoral politics. I'm always going to represent for Lowndes County. So I have to come back here, come home. One of the first Black women to seek elected office here locally in Lowndes County was a woman who did not live that far from me, but her name was Miss Alice Moore. So Alice Moore was one of the first Black women to be on the ballot under the banner of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And you see the panther on the wall over my shoulder. That was the logo for the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And as a Black woman, what she wanted to do was to run for a tax assessor for Lowndes County. And her motto was tax the rich to feed the poor. So you can imagine at that particular time, that was a very bold statement to have
Indeed.
as your political slogan. And you're saying that you're going to tax the rich to feed the poor. And knowing the legacy of Lowndes County had already earned the name of Bloody Lowndes. And it wasn't called Bloody Lowndes just by happenstance. It was called Bloody Lowndes because of the white supremacy violence that often took place in this county. So for a Black woman to be one of the first Black women to run for elected office in this county, where we knew racial violence still existed, and you're saying that you're going to run under a banner of taxing the rich to feed the poor, was very bold. So the early Black women, some of the first Black women to run for elected office, they were often like Miss Alice Moore. They were often very bold. They were very clear about what they were running for, but they were also mindful of, at the time when we just had the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that it was still going to be a battle and an uphill climb to get elected, whether you were running in Lowndes County or whether you were running for elected office in Detroit, Michigan. You were still going to deal with the same dynamics, and you were still going to have to struggle to convince people to vote for you. And the struggle wasn't necessarily always tied to convincing other people of other races to vote for you. There was still a lot of fear especially here in Lowndes County, there was still a lot of fear in even the Black electorate, in terms of supporting Black candidates when they ran for office. So yeah, we did have a lot of Black women who ran for elected office when the time presented itself where they could run. And we know one of the first Black women, well, the first Black woman to be elected to Congress, Shirley Chisholm, also had a very bold campaign slogan at one point in her political career. Her slogan was that she was unbought and unbossed. But she also had this famous statement where she said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. So that meant that if you are not afforded the opportunity to have a seat willingly, basically her that statement is indicative of how Black women were positioned when they ran for office. A lot of times they had to force the people already at the table to make room for them. But a lot of them did persist, and they were elected to office. And from 1960, late 1960 through the early 1970s, we started to see a lot of firsts. Yvonne Burke, for example, 1972 became the first Black woman elected to a House seat in the state of California. 1973, Barbara Jordan, first Black woman from the Deep South, and she was elected to Congress to represent Texas. Then we had Cardis Collins in Illinois in 1973, I think. She was elected after her husband, Representative George Collins, passed away. So we did have a legacy of Black women first. And unfortunately, we still, in some areas, even to this day, we're still experiencing first. I think it was 2018, 2019 became the year of the Black woman mayor, because we had a lot of firsts in terms of Black women winning mayorships across this country. So we're still making strides, and we're still seeing progress. And we can even see that progress with the recent presidential election, where Kamala Harris being the first Black Asian vice president. So we are still experiencing a lot of firsts in terms of electoral politics for Black women and women of color in general. But we still have a ways to go, because when we look at the demographics of this country and the demographic shifts in this country, we also know that while we are still experiencing first, the representation that we currently have in elected office doesn't necessarily mirror the proportion of the population, the representation of Black women in the general population.
Indeed, indeed. Now, would it be a stretch from your perspective for me to say that Black women have been at the forefront of voting rights since the turn of the century? Like, if we had to attribute that position to any demographic in America, that I would assert Black women have earned that place.
It is definitely, Black women have always been at the forefront of movements when we talk about extending access to the ballot box. Black women have always been involved in the organizing efforts, not just organizing for state and local politics, but organizing for federal elections, be it congressional seats, Senate seats, presidential elections. They're always on the front line. But I also always say that as a country, we have to move beyond the narrative of thanking Black women. You know, recently after every election, you see thank a Black woman. After Georgia turned blue, it's like thank Black women, thank Stacey Abrams, thank Latasha Brown for their organizing work. That is great. But I also always say that Black women can't always be the mules for this country. It means that we can't help get everybody elected but ourselves. So I'd rather not thank Black women. I'd rather if we elected more Black women. That's the way, in my opinion, that you really thank Black women. If you really appreciate the work that they're doing, thank them by supporting them in terms of the organizing and grassroots efforts for their campaigns, donate to their campaigns, volunteer to their campaigns, and even our national organizing structures for DNC, Democratic Congressional Committee, the Senate Committee. Support them with your resources. That's how you thank them if you really truly appreciate what they're doing, because we can't always show up and save America from itself. But that seems to be the narrative lately.
Yes, and that's something I wanted to address. I feel, but I'm a Black man, so I perceive it differently than a Black woman would. But I have a mixed feeling about this notion that Black women have to save this country. Like, I mean, it's almost like the magical Negro from the Key and Peele sketch. It's like y'all like Bagger Vance or Mammy, for lack of a better way to put it. Like teach, the baby America. So not Uncle Sam, but nephew Sam, bring them around to their better nature type deal. I don't know, but what's your feelings on that?
So I often tell my students when we talk about the role of women, particularly now in politics, it is almost like Black women are supposed to be America's wet nurse. When I say wet nurse, that means that we're supposed to deny ourselves, deny even our own basic needs, and to a certain extent, almost be willing to deny our own humanity to nurse America and to help America be what it claims to be. So we expect we always hear the narrative, thank Black women. It's okay for us to get out and get other people elected. Make sure that our communities show up on election day. Make sure that they're registered to vote. And then even now, if we look, Georgia, clearly the Georgia legislature didn't take too kindly to Democrats being elected to the Senate for the state, because just look at the number of voter suppression measures coming out of the Georgia legislature. And then now we're supposed to get Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff elected, and now we have to save access to the ballot box for the same people who showed up for them by organizing to fight these voter suppression measures. So it's like we're constantly fighting, and the fight takes away our ability to have that seat at the table that Shirley Chisholm talked about, because we're always fighting the next battle that we never get to the point where we're positioned and stable enough to even build the groundwork for our own campaigns and our own political futures. So we do the work, even if that means that we have to be told once we get these people elected, well, because we don't want to be perceived as being the candidate for Black people, let's just wait and we'll get to your issue, but wait, we'll get to it. So we do the work, but then we're told, well, now you got to wait, or now you have to fight this other battle so that when the next election comes around, your community actually can go and safely vote and not have to deal with these barriers and these other tactics of voter suppression. So we're constantly saving America from itself, or saving ourselves from America. I don't know which one is actually true, but we're constantly in savior mode when it comes to our communities and making sure that voting rights are protected in our communities.
Indeed. Now, just to back up a little bit in time, along with these things we've just said, it's been that counter narrative that's been presented about African American women, about Black women, and it's been weaponized politically, right? And that is this notion that the Black woman and her children are burdens on America, burdens on society. And it reminds me of when I was a child. uh, I'm born in '75, so what I can remember is that long decade of the '80s for myself, the Reagan era, and this notion of the welfare queen and how they was presented as a straw person in opposition to uh, strengthening and maintaining those social safety nets for the working poor and the lower economic classes in America. Do you how has that impacted Black women's engagement in politics, and does those legacies endure?
Unfortunately, they do endure. And that legacy is another part of the fight that we're constantly engaged in. Because almost every election cycle, we hear those dog whistles. I don't even know if we can call them dog whistles, but in political science, we refer to them as political dog whistles. But they're so loud that anyone should be able to hear them, right? And those dog whistles, like you said, that particularly around social safety net programs, that started with the Reagan era. But if we back up to the war on poverty, LBJ and the war on poverty. So when LBJ was touring this country to promote his war on poverty legislative piece, this package included programs like Medicaid, Medicare. The Head Start program is one of the programs out of the war on poverty. There were spending measures for education and all sorts of tax cuts aimed at creating jobs in this country. So that was a part of the war on poverty legislative piece, right? And so as LBJ is touring the country, promoting the war on poverty, promoting this legislative package, he visits this family in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, white family, Tom Fletcher. So Tom Fletcher, old white guy who lived with his wife, his 8 children. The year before, LBJ is touring to promote the war on poverty legislative package. Tom Fletcher had only earned $400 in terms of a yearly salary, $400 for the entire year. So he and his family became the face of poverty in this country, right? So the press pool, they take all these pictures of Tom Fletcher and his family sitting on the porch talking to LBJ. A couple of national magazines, national news outlets pick up this picture. So this family becomes the face of poverty in this country. So when this family is the face of poverty in this country, poverty is humanized in terms of these people deserve help. As a country, we have to help these particular people, right? But if you fast forward to the 1980s, the image and the images that the media uses to categorize who's benefiting, who's using safety net programs starts to change. And so then you hear Ronald Reagan talks about this lady in Chicago who has all these identities and who's getting all this money because she's created all these fake identities and she's gaming the system. And now she becomes like this stereotypical image of the welfare queen. And so as she becomes the face of welfare abuse or welfare fraud in this country, then the welfare queen stereotype is now levied against every Black woman who needs social safety net programs. So we're no longer humanizing poverty in terms of who needs help. Now we're saying that these are the undeserving recipients of these particular programs. And so now we've moved from the narrative when it comes to social safety nets about deserving poor, and now we have this narrative about the undeserving poor. And so Ronald Reagan's depiction of the welfare queen kind of sticks and it lasts. Even moving into the 90s, there's this book, Martin Gillen's. His book is called Why Americans Hate Welfare. And so what Gillens does in his book, he looks at media stories about social safety net programs from the 80s through the late 90s. And what he uncovers is that public opinion about welfare shifts based on who the media, what image the media attaches to a story. And what the media had began to do after Reagan's welfare queen, if there was a story, a media story about the successes of a social safety net program and how this program was working, the media always attached a white face. If there were media stories about why there was abuse or fraud or why a program was not working, coincidentally or not so coincidentally, it was a black face. So what Gillens discovers is that when white faces are attached to welfare stories, we continue to see public opinion go up because they deserve it, because it's going to work. They're going to do what's right. But when the media attaches black faces, public opinion or support for social safety nets go down because they're undeserving. They're going to waste it. They don't really need the help. And so that's been the legacy of Ronald Reagan's welfare queen narrative. But what people don't point out is that while the Fletcher family became the face of the war on poverty, they themselves were accused of allegedly abusing even the social safety nets that they were afforded access to. And so there's this narrative about who deserves help, who doesn't deserve help. But the Reagan narrative about the welfare queen has sort of stayed, and it's tied up into these other caricatures of Black women.
Yes.
It's connected to this idea that Black women are lazy, or they are extremely promiscuous, because there was the other part of the welfare queen narrative is that these Black women were, because they were so promiscuous, they were having babies, they were having so many babies, and all of their babies were then qualifying for these social safety net programs. So it is one of the most harmful stereotypes levied against Black women, and it has had a lasting and enduring legacy because it basically makes those who are opposed to providing and properly funding social safety net programs to begin with, it kind of gives them an out and an outlet to say, well, they don't need to help anyway. If only they would get a job, or if only they would pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But it also ignores some of the other barriers and factors that impact a woman's or even a man's ability to provide for his or her family.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Now, simultaneous with that is that it's coming from two different places and coalescing, but that conservative strand in the Black community, as well as this modern day, the best I can say is faux woke community, right? And it's it's this notion that I believe is rooted in the response to the Moynihan report and the Moynihan report itself, and this notion that the way the Black community is structured and the leadership roles that the Black woman has taken in our community is a pathology as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to an asset or just a being, the verb to be, I am, right? Just, as opposed to that's just what it is, but it is presented as a negative. And there's been a lot of unproductive discourse in regards to Black women's recent leadership, and it being attributed to some kind of crisis of masculinity or whatever in the Black community, right? It's all jumbled in this crazy anamorphous ball that they throw at the wall and see what sticks. Has that pushback had a negative or much of a negative impact in the way that Black women have been politically organizing?
I don't know if it necessarily had an impact in the way that Black women have been politically organizing, but I do think that it is something that is always present in the political, social, and civic movements of Black women. But I do want to go back and kind of touch on like some of those misconceptions, if that's okay. Because typically what we see, particularly from some facets of politics and from American society, is this notion that, or this idea that Black women are in the position that they're in terms of like their socioeconomic status, because Black men don't want to be present, and that's not true. um, Usually what those conversations ignore is the fact that from the, if we look and trace history from the end of slavery to modern day, the movements of Black men have also been sort of caricatured. So Black men, just like Black women, haven't been able to necessarily escape those caricatures of being like the mammy or the sapphire, or whatever else you want to say with regards to the angry Black woman, the promiscuous Black woman, the lazy Black woman. Then Black men have also had to navigate these ideas of being also overly sexualized, being considered violent. And so those stereotypes have also impacted policies that have impacted the ability of Black men to be present and show up in their families the way that they would want to. So we cannot divorce the stereotypes levied against both Black women and Black men from the makeup that we see when we talk about the Black family.
Indeed.
um we hear all these stories about like marriage in the Black community, but those stories and those narratives are usually divorced from this other reality that's rooted in public policy. Let's talk about the war on drugs, or the perceived war on drugs, and the impact that that has had on the prison industrial complex in this country, and the impact that that complex has also had on the makeup of the Black family and the Black community.
Indeed, indeed, and that's what I think people aren't emphasizing enough, because then they'll see the beauty, the potential, and the strength that, right, that despite or in spite of all these structural destructive forces to the Black family, to the Black community, that Black women have been able to hold Black families together, right? And then by default or by extension, hold Black communities together, as opposed to viewing it as a strength. It's being presented as that is the problem in the Black community, as opposed to these, let's be real, these structural and more and equally important, these policy implications, right?
Hmm.
And that kind of leads me to, right, we know how policy impacts culture and culture impacts policy, right? Uh, are we seeing uh, that the Black women's political voice and artistic expression and in cultural expression today as we have seen in the past? Because I mean, if we're being honest, if we're looking back on the long civil rights movement, as some people would frame it, but going back to the turn of the century all the way up, Black women artists they've been really the voice and the soundtrack for the movement, right?
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, are we seeing that today? That political, artistic voice expression.
I think we are to a certain extent. But in terms of like our music, I'll have to be honest. I don't necessarily know if we see that level of social activism in our music the way that we did. Because if you think about like the civil rights movement, you you're hard you can barely find a Black artist that did not have like some sort of socially conscious message in at least one song, right?
Yeah.
Then you had those artists whose almost their entire career was situated in some sort of civic and social and political activism. Not everyone in the 60s was a Nina Simone, for example. But we did see songs from artists that reflected the time. I don't know if we have that level of activism in our music today. And the artists that do attempt to have those kinds of messages, unfortunately, their voices are suppressed to a certain extent. Because even in the 90s, I mean, we had like our coming of age music. We had like Tupac and Public Enemy and artists like that. I don't know if I can name someone today who is producing like the kind of messages in their music, and a part of it may be that I just don't really listen
Yeah.
to the
No,
radio.
indeed.
I
Indeed.
don't really listen to the radio for real. I stick with what I know, but yeah, there was a point where all of our artistic expressions in our communities were in some ways aimed at elevating not only our self-esteem, but also elevating our causes to a certain extent. Um, I do think that we probably see those kinds of messages more in like film and movies, because Ava DuVernay kind of does a great job of making sure that she incorporates some of those messages in like some of her productions. And I know I don't want to get into a history lesson, but I know that some historians particularly critiqued like Selma, for example, and even I critiqued it to a certain extent,
Yeah.
but there was still like this elevation of the narrative in the historical legacies present in her work.
Us
Um,
historians, we gonna dislike any historical movie. I mean, it is what it is. Oh, so yeah, indeed. I feel that way pretty much. I avoid watching most of them because I don't want to be that guy. But so I understand. I do.
yes.
But I
And
agree with
even I do that to a certain extent. It's like I'll watch stuff and I'll point out like some of the historical inaccuracies, but I recognize that not everything is meant to. And I think that's a part of the problem, though. Some people take modern day productions or historical films or films that have a historical nature and assume that it is like following the history to a science or to the T, and that's not necessarily the case. So a part of the critique is on the viewers, not necessarily on the producers.
you. Okay. Your sister said the artist HER is coming.
Her,
Yeah.
oh,
I don't know. I guess I'll YouTube it afterwards and discuss. I've
I
heard the
guess we will both.
yes.
Um, I don't know.
But I agree with you, and I think that's an important point. Because I'm looking at the work of several many Black women, what they're doing in film in particular, uh, and they are putting a lot of these issues on the menu,
Hmm.
to stimulate thought, to stimulate discourse, right? Because in many ways, our country is in a place where we're not really having discourse, and more importantly, to me, within the Black community, I don't really feel like we're, having the type of discourse that we have had in the past uh,
Hmm.
about certain topics and certain things. Now, speaking of contemporary issues, in this moment right now, it seems that Black women are mobilizing communities in many different ways, right? We're seeing the political mobilization of Stacey Abrams.
Hmm.
We're seeing social movement mobilization of Tamika Mallory and the Black Lives Matter. Uh, and then we saw the type of coalition mobilization that Vice President Kamala Harris, in many ways, I guess, inspired, to be quite honest with you, right? Uh, what trends do you see emerging that might be able to tell us about the directions that this type of mobilization is taking the community?
I definitely see where, particularly political mobilization is aimed at not necessarily just getting people to the ballot box. I'm seeing that political organizing efforts led by Black women are more like holistic organizing efforts. So these are efforts where these women are taking into consideration what happens in this community after election day. So it's not so much to get you to the poll and get you to show up on election day, but what are your conditions and what are your circumstances beyond election day. So I'm starting to see where organizing is more not just to get out the vote, moving from simply getting out the vote to getting you engaged in the process of being able to fight for yourself. And I think that is where, especially in the Black community, some previous organizing efforts have failed the Black community, because most of those efforts were about, let's get you to the poll on election day. After the election is over, we don't see you until it's time to vote again. So I'm starting to see where organizing efforts are more long-term, they're more sustainable, and it's not just getting you to show up on election day, but what does it look like to organize and fight for yourself once these people are even in office? What does accountability look like? So a lot of people can tell you a lot of things when they want your vote, but when they're in office, what does it look like after they've gotten what they want from you? So I'm starting to see where the organizing efforts are focusing on like accountability, but also what are some of the other issues that are impacting you on an everyday basis. Because a lot of times we typically also would see organizing efforts pick up around presidential elections. What about the state and local elections? What about your city council or your county commission election? What about the mayoral elections in your area? Or what about if there are ballot measures that you need to be informed and engaged about after the election? So I'm starting to see that the efforts are more sustainable long term, but also it's about meeting people where they are. That is very important, because we hear a lot of critiques about Black voters, and I'm starting to see Black women particularly speak up about, well, let's stop trying to chastise people when they don't show up to vote. Ask them why they didn't show up. And what we hear is that a lot of times people talk about, well, I've been let down, disappointed, my vote doesn't matter, my vote doesn't make a difference. So I'm starting to see voter engagement and voter education efforts to make sure that people understand how they're impacted and how even not showing up has an impact on them, and what it means when you don't show up to actually vote. But even if you show up and vote and it doesn't go your way, what can you still do even after that person is in office, whether it's the person that you voted for or the person that you did not vote for. So that is very promising. Because the needs in our communities, they don't disappear when we get our candidate in office. Um, I'm definitely excited to see more trends toward long-term holistic organizing efforts.
Awesome, awesome. And I think that will produce more Black women being elected to elected positions. And speaking to what you're saying on, all right, we do so much of the heavy lifting, it's time for you all to, be elected,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, and kind of speaking to that, do you think it's possible that a legitimate Black conservative women's movement can gain some steam within the GOP? Because right now, when I say that to say, so I should be fair and qualified from where I'm coming from, is I look at people like Candace Owens, right? And I just feel like I feel about many Black conservatives, like their whole approach is wrong. Like if they believe their message, like some of that message will already resonate with many sectors of the Black community. But so much of their approach and their assumptions about Black people are so offensive to Black people, and particularly to Black women, because that's what we're talking about today. Uh, and it's like, I often wonder if she took another approach and dedicated to her career, as opposed to making it is what it now. It's too toxic for her to do it now. But on engaging and interacting with Black women over conservative ideals, she might have had much more success, of
Mm-hmm.
achieving her goals of trying to, you know, present political competition in the Black community. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Or do you see? I know you mentioned, uh, or was it something I was reading earlier that they mentioned that it was a handful of Black women that ran for office in the 2020 cycle as conservatives. You know.
Hmm. So I definitely think that there is a difference between being a legitimate conservative candidate and a token conservative candidate. Um, so when I say a legitimate conservative, well, let me explain what I mean. A token first. Um, you can't just be the black face to say that we have a black supporter. So you can't just be the black face for conservatives to bring out at their campaign rallies, have you standing over their shoulder when they're speaking. You can't just be that person to say, that's almost like, oh, I got a black friend kind of situation. So you can't be that black person. So there's a difference between being involved in a conservative movement in a tokenized way and in a way that's based on substance and public policy. So I do think that it is possible for black women to be conservatives, because believe it or not, in the South, but like here in Alabama, there are a lot of black women who are conservatives, but they vote as Democrats because they think that because I'm black, I need to be a Democrat. But if you actually have a conversation with them and listen to their views on particular policies, they actually align with conservative ideology.
Mm,
So I do think that if you had black women candidates who spoke to the issues and spoke to their issues in a conservative ideology type way, then it is possible that they could peel off some black voters, because we also have to recognize and contend with the fact that while black women still overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, there is still, like, there are conversations even among black women about their dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party as a whole. So I do think that if a black woman conservative could actually speak to policy and substance and not allow herself to be portrayed as a tokenized version of black woman conservatism, it is possible. It is more possible than you think, because there are a lot of, like here in Alabama, there are a lot of black women who have very conservative positions on issues, social issues, particularly like abortion,
yeah.
same-sex marriage, even like the legalization and decriminalization of marijuana. So those are some of those social issues that I think that, or gambling is another big topic here in Alabama. So those are some of those social issues where I do think like a conservative message would resonate with some black women, particularly those black women who are at that intersection of the black woman identity in religion.
Yeah.
Because believe it or not, a lot of black churches are, they still preach very conservative messages in Alabama, and I'm sure that's indicative of the South.
Indeed, I've experienced it here in North Carolina, so I can attest to, yes, it is probably widespread throughout the South and in many sectors in the Midwest as well, from my
Hmm.
experience growing up there. And I think it's just such a shame because I think much of what you said, uh, and with some different nuances, could be said of many Black men, right? And
Hmm.
we've been tracking that, and much of the discourse has been just a narrow analysis, based upon misogyny and the issue with Hillary Clinton, her being a woman. Some will acknowledge about the super predator statement that they attribute to Joe Biden, but it was Hillary who said it. Although he
Hmm.
did craft the bill, I get the whole mix and putting it all together in one ball and throw it against the wall and see what sticks. I get that, but then people were expressing that that was the case why some Black men didn't vote for Biden and Harris, simply because it was Harris, a woman, a woman of color, a Black Asian woman on the ballot. and kind of sidestepping away from the crime bill of 1994, which has been a thorn, but Biden won because of all the work that Black women did. And many of us Black men, like myself, who voted third party, didn't vote for Clinton nor Trump. I voted third party. I didn't vote third party this time, right? So some of us came around to help y'all in that regard. But you know, but they're not looking at those broader things like you said about, you know, these conservative ideas and policies. And I get so frustrated with Black conservatives because even how they even reach out to Black people is such an ineffective way where no one will even take the time to listen to you because you came in a sideways, disrespectful way with these condescending and disrespectful assumptions, you know, and it just shuts the whole conversation down,
Right.
you know. And I believe, and as a political scientist, I seek your perspective. I mean, I believe it can only help Black people politically if we begin to foster true competition for our votes, you know, between these two parties, and hopefully a third party emerge. But as it stands, these two parties, right? Because I think in many ways they don't compete. One just says we're not going to get it, and the other takes it for granted, right?
hmm I definitely see how the Democratic Party takes the Black vote for granted because it's assumed that I'm going to get it anyway, and that was one of my criticisms of Doug Jones when he was seeking reelection for the Senate here in Alabama. It was almost as if he didn't campaign to Black communities and Black audiences, and if he did any campaigning, it was like right at the last minute. So it's this assumption that, well, I don't necessarily need to invest time and resources to trying to get that vote because I know I'm going to get it anyway. And that is one of the problems or critiques that I have of the Democratic Party. It takes for granted that the Black vote will always be there, but I do agree that if we had some sort of competition, we shouldn't just give anyone our vote without them actually explaining what their policy positions are or what the policy positions will be if they're elected. And if they are elected, don't just keep voting for them just because they have that D on their name, beside their name. And that is one of the problems in Alabama. And I don't know about North Carolina, but Alabama is one of a few states that still has what we call straight ticket voting. So when we get to the general election, you can go in and you can just mark Democrat, and every Democrat on the ballot will get your vote. I always discourage that because that is a part of the complacency for Democrats in this space. If they get through the primary, they figure if I'm in a district that is a Democrat district, I'm going to win, because once we get to the general election, people are just going to go in and select Democrat, and everybody on the ballot is going to win. I never do that. I go line by line. There are some candidates and some offices that I just don't vote for because I don't feel that either the Democrat or the Republican deserves my vote, or
Yeah.
that they are one and the same. Because that's another thing that we have here in Alabama. If there are Republicans who reside in districts that are heavily Democrat districts, they become Democrats just for election day, because they know if they can make it through the primary and get to the general election, that's all they need to do. They can be a Republican in terms of their policy positions, but if they have that D beside their name, they know that they can be elected. And so we do need more diversity and more outreach to our communities in terms of securing our vote and getting our vote. But we also need candidates who will do what they told us that they would do once they get elected. And I do think that moving forward, we need to continue to engage with our communities to make sure that um, we hold those people accountable. I always in class I tell my students, treat election day like a job interview. You wouldn't hire someone if they didn't show up for the interview. So if they didn't show up to campaign for your vote, why are you going to vote for them on election day just because they have a particular party identification beside their name?
Awesome, awesome. And we have a question from the chat, and I think it is poignant. So I'll frame it like this. What other avenues besides voting, securing voting rights, other issues that Black women are tackling in the electorate? It was mentioned in the chat, thinking of things like healthcare, advocacy for special needs children in the special needs community, uh, uh, regardless of the age, those types of things that you see happening.
Mhm. Well, actually, that's a great question. And one of the I'm actually working on a journal article that basically tackles this precise issue. Healthcare advocacy initiatives that are led by Black women. What are their motivations? What are their successes? And what we find, or what we see, is that Black women typically take that same sort of organizing strategy that they use in terms of engaging communities for elections, and they apply those same sorts of measures to other policy issues. And so we see Black women on the front lines advocating for health care, for equitable access to things like reproductive health care. In Alabama, there are a lot of Black women who are advocating for the extension of the Medicaid, extending Medicaid in the state of Alabama, because we have a doctor shortage in the state of Alabama. We also have a hospital shortage in the state of Alabama. We have a resource shortage when it comes to resources for children with special health care needs, whether they be children or adults. So we don't have a public health care infrastructure that is conducive to providing adequate resources for persons with special healthcare needs, disability resources, any sort of medical resources. And unfortunately, we see this drought of medical access and medical resources in the Alabama Black Belt region. So the Alabama Black Belt region is that particular area of the state, the midsection of the state that runs from the Mississippi border to the Georgia border. But these 17 counties also happen to be the 17 counties where we have the highest population of Black residents. That is no coincidence, because it's called the Black Belt. Booker T. Washington gave it this name because of the rich, fertile Black soil. So this is the area of Alabama that was the king cotton area of the state. So when cotton was king in this state, this is where we saw the highest concentration of slave plantations and farms producing cotton. These are also still the same areas where Black families continue to be highly concentrated in these counties, with the exception of Montgomery, because Montgomery County, the capital, is also considered a Black Belt county, but demographically, it is not the same as these other 16 counties, because these are the highest Black population, the highest poverty rate, the highest unemployment rate. And now we're seeing that this is also the area where we have the highest rate in terms of the lack of healthcare access and lack of doctors and lack of medical resources. And this COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated these inequalities that exist in the Alabama Black Belt region. So we see that there are Black women, particularly Black women in all of these Black Belt counties, who are advocating for better, more equitable access to healthcare, asking the state to cover Alabama, meaning cover Alabama by extending or expanding Medicaid, and also pushing the state to fund healthcare infrastructures like medical facilities and hospitals across this state. That is the kind of organizing that I referenced earlier, where Black women are taking like this holistic approach to organizing. So it's not just voting, but it's also these other issues that impact you on a daily basis: your education, your health care, your ability to get to work, child care, all of those issues. And we see that Black women are taking the lead on organizing around all of those efforts.
Awesome. That reminds me of some localized organizing that was happening in some of the dilapidated Midwestern metropolises back in the 80s and 90s. Black women's organizations created for welfare rights and water rights. They always shutting off the damn water, man. Right? And water rights. And I know, because a lot of from my dissertation, a lot of women from my case studies You know, that's what they went on to do after the time period of, so they were black power organizers. So when that movement folded, they went into that type of organizing. Now, speaking of Lowndes County, in the Lowndes County Freedom Party, uh, the first Black Panthers, the political party, not the Black Panther Party for self-defense, right? Uh, do you think it's possible for Black people to reconsider, at least on a localized level, of organizing independent parties?
I do think it is possible. But I think that it is possible with a few caveats. And let me just talk and speak about Lowndes County, for example. One of my critiques of modern day politics here in Lowndes County is that for some reason, it seems that Black voters here have allowed white candidates to kind of co-opt the organizing strategies of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. It is not uncommon when we're leading up to a local election, and when I mentioned earlier about those Republicans who become Democrats, it is not uncommon that we see Republicans become Democrats because Lowndes County is overwhelmingly a blue county. So they become Democrats to get your vote. They also use basically like the same sort of method that our grandparents used when they were organizing here in Lowndes County, right? They show up at your church. They know that the Black church and the role of the Black church in connecting with Black voters and with getting out the vote in Black communities. They would show up at your church. During one election, we even had one church, and I'm not going to call names, but there was one Black church that allowed a white candidate to be the guest speaker at their MLK program, or Black History Month. It was Black History Month or MLK, which I thought was interesting for a number of reasons. This particular candidate frequents the churches, particularly the Black churches, when he wants your vote, right? So I do think it is possible, but I do think that there has to be like this education or re-education about why it is important that some of our institutions remain our institutions and remain our safe spaces for talking about our needs and about our politics. Because I mentioned Alice Moore at the beginning of our discussion, but one of the things that was indicative of candidates who wanted to run under the banner of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization was that their platforms had to be based on conversations with the community. So while they were the candidates and they were going to be the face of the community, they had to shape and structure their platforms based on what the community said they wanted. So when Alice Moore said tax the rich to feed the poor, she knew what the poverty rate was in Lowndes County. She knew what the food insecurity looked like in Lowndes County. So that became her slogan because she knew what the people of Lowndes County needed at that time. So there has to be a re-education and an understanding of why the organizers organized in the manner that they organized, why they chose certain strategies, certain techniques, and why they wanted to make sure that any candidate who ran under the banner of Lowndes County Freedom Organization, their platform had to reflect what the community wanted. So I do think it is possible, and I do think that we have the blueprint based on the organizing framework used by Lowndes County at the time. So we have a framework, we have a blueprint, but I do think that it has to be like a true education about what that framework and what that blueprint looked like and why it looked the way that it looked. And I do think that narrative has kind of been lost in some regards. So I do think that once we have honest conversations and honest dialogue about our history and a true understanding of our history, then I do think it's possible. And I personally think that it is necessary if we want to see some of the public policy changes that we always rely on other candidates to fulfill once they're elected. And we hear, well, you need to wait. Well, wait until we do this first, or we need to do this first, or I can't be like Barack Obama. I can't be the president for just Black people. So I do think that it is possible, but there has to be like some true dialogue and some true understanding of historical organizing in Black communities. And that doesn't necessarily mean Stokely Carmichael, Black Politics and Politics of Liberation. One of my favorite quotes in that book, where he said, Black representation is not necessarily Black power. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have, while ideally we would want a Black person, a person who looks like us to represent us, but we have to also be mindful that not all of our skin folk are our kin folk. So sometimes we have to not necessarily support the person who looks like us all the time, or we need to make sure that the person who looks like us don't just look like us in terms of hue and pigmentation, that they look like us in terms of policy preferences as well.
Indeed, indeed. And I'm glad you said all that because it reassures me that I'm not the only one who feels the exact same way. Excuse me. I say quite frequently to people, and I get frustrated sometimes because I'll be like, I already told y'all, now I'm going to be repeating myself. Well, what do we do? You know, that's always the go-to when you offer a critique of something, which is a legitimate go-to. Well, what are you suggesting we do, right? And I always say, we have the blueprint, we have the case study, we have the model, right? Lowndes County, right? And then if you needed to get some type of theoretical framework, just a rudimentary foundation, then it's, for me, Stokely Carmichael, that same book, right? And, you know, so I'm glad. That lets me know then that I'm not just simply crazy, but maybe we're just biased. That could be true. I mean, because not only are we aware of the practice of it and the potential of it, you know, but we are aware of it intimately. You, of course, way more intimately than myself, right? But you know, even as you mentioned, everybody in Lowndes County say they got a cousin in Detroit, a family member in Detroit. I remember growing up in Detroit, and then when we moved to Romulus, going to visit in Detroit, where I thought all Black people came from Lowndes County, Alabama, because everywhere we went, everybody on the block was from Lowndes County, Alabama. And how did I know that? Because that's all the adults was talking about. People in Lowndes County, visiting them, Uncle Junior down there right now calling on the phone, or Uncle Zeke down there calling back on the phone, and all of those things. I really felt that way. And, you know, but we have these models, right? Kind of ideas thought of in Mississippi, right? Mistakes made. Let's not make these mistakes, you know, in Alabama. Like, so this is like through trial and error as well. So I just feel that Black people, many Black people who are disaffected, they feel paralyzed. Like, you know, like, well, I'm tired of just Republican or Democrat. I don't trust either one. They're the same to me, right? So I'm just going to disengage altogether, and which is extremely problematic for our growth. But a constant through much of that has been Black women, you know, pushing back against that, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think Black women, as a, you know, in regards to organizing, what types of things do Black men need to know that we need to do, can do, or what we need to stop doing to help the community and better assist the Black women who are doing much of this heavy lifting?
I think one of the first pieces of this puzzle, right, is that Black men and women, to a certain extent, we have to unlearn what we've been told about ourselves. Because another quote that I often use in my class is Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro. If you can control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions.
Indeed.
And so we've had these seeds planted in us, that makes it a little bit difficult for us to understand each other. So a lot of it has to start with us unlearning what we've been told about ourselves. So we've to a certain extent, we've internalized a lot of the false narratives about ourselves, and it is not a mistake that we've internalized or learned these things about ourselves, right?
Mhm.
So it is a part of the plan to really keep us from owning and coming into our full power and our full being. So
Indeed.
a first step is to unlearn everything that we've been conditioned to believe about ourselves.
Mhm.
If that's the first piece. The next piece is that I think that we have to work on understanding why, for example, why do Black women advocate for these particular policies. So work on understanding each other, work on understanding our policy positions and even our policy differences, because even in the Black community, Democrats, people who know that they are Democrats, they have different views on certain issues, but we have to find that common ground or that middle ground and understand how by working together it benefits the entire Black community as a whole. So I think that's the first step, unlearning what we've been conditioned to believe about ourselves. And then once we unlearn and deprogram ourselves from that misinformation, then we can better hear and better understand each other as we try to organize our communities. And another piece of it is that we have to also understand, as Black women, why some Black men don't want to engage in politics, why they don't trust the certain political systems, or why they don't support particular candidates. So I do think that a lot of the work has to be done in understanding each other and understanding our differences and having true dialogue. And that dialogue cannot take place on social media, because we know when you try to discuss these issues on social media, people are really playing for an audience and not necessarily playing to understand each other. So these have to be real, intimate conversations and real sincere dialogue about understanding each other, understanding our policy differences and our policy preferences.
Indeed. Well said. Well said. And I would say to the fellas, and we can't approach those conversations in the patriarchal way with these antiquated notions that I'm the man, she's supposed to listen to what I say, or my ideas are better than hers. You know,
Exactly.
yeah, I'm an educator, as you are as well, Dr. Moore. We are educators, and we know it don't matter what your anatomy is, what your biology is in any way, gender, sexuality, skin tone, pigmentation, national origin. None of that has any bearing on someone's capacity to process information, analyze it, and present information, But
Right.
some people still holding on to these antiquated ideas, which is, just so problematic. And do you think that the advance or the growth of Black women in the pulpit has contributed to some of these growing successes? Because I know when I lived in Robinson County, North Carolina, I attended the AME Zion Church for about a year, and it was called St. James Mount Zion Church, Mount Zion. Wait, let me get it right. St. James AME Mount Zion Church in Red Springs, North Carolina, and the pastor was Reverend Sharon Mitchell, and she is a wonderful pastor, right? But I recognize that I had a treat. Not only was Black Jesus painted on the big old mural when I walked in, I also had the double treat of, a growing trend, but still not grown enough, of a Black woman pastor. Do you think that in some ways the growth of that has contributed to some of the explosion and further advances Black women have done in politics?
I do think that those trends are sort of running parallel, right? So whether they have actually run to the point where they actually intersect. I'm not exactly sure, but these are definitely parallel trends and parallel movements. I do think though that the rise of women in the pulpit definitely contributes to the rise of women's leadership in other areas of society, particularly and especially also in politics, because I do think that some of those social issues that I mentioned earlier, where we still see a lot of conservatism with regards to some of those social issues, I do think that having a woman's voice from a pulpit helps to kind of neutralize even like some of the conservatism around some of those issues when we talk about like women's reproductive health. But I do think that there is sort of another trend that's running like sort of parallel to the trend of the rise of Black women in political politics and in political organizing, the rise of Black women in pulpits and churches. But there's also running parallel to the increase of like the education access and educational levels for Black women. So I do think we're seeing like three trends that are sort of running along the same intersection. Well, at some point, those three are going to kind of cross over and intersect. Um, so I definitely think that helps, and I also think that matters when we go back to your previous question about what will it take for there to be better understanding between Black men and Black women. There has to be like some sort of understanding of the changing role of the Black woman in everyday society. We're no longer like at the point where the woman stays at home and take care of the household, raises the kids. So there has to be like some sort of recognition of like the changing trends and the changing roles of Black women in everyday society in almost every facet of life. Um, so I definitely think that the increase of women in the pulpit, it definitely matters. It influences the messaging because in political science, another thing that we say when we talk about the institutions that influence our public opinion and political ideology, after the family, the next institution that has the biggest influence on us in terms of what we believe in politics is the church and our religious institutions. So I definitely think that it definitely matters, and it matters what sort of message we are hearing and we are consuming when we attend religious services.
Indeed, indeed. And I think that's so important, because I don't think enough people recognize how, various advances and more equality in various spheres impacts all these other spheres, right?
Hmm.
The interconnectedness of our lives, of what intersectionality truly means, of these intersections of all these various different interests, that a person has, and various identities, you know,
Hmm.
that a person has. Now, I read some data that indicated that Black women are among the top demographic in regards to education indexes, speaking to what you were saying. Uh, and, uh, and obviously, we know that contributed for a myriad of reasons, right? But do you think that that is discussed and emphasized enough when we're talking about the impact of Black women in society, as well as the challenges and successes of Black women? Just that level of success you all are having based on education indexes.
I don't think it is because what I don't think that a lot of people recognize is that there is like this other external factor that contributes to Black women becoming like one of the most educated demographics in society, right? And the ugly side of that is that we have to show up when we show up for an interview. We have to be almost 10 times better to even be considered a viable candidate, right? So we don't talk about the necessity for us to become like the most educated demographic. Um, a lot of times you will have, and I remember talking about this with my students, and we were looking at like some labor trends and some labor data where a white man with a high school diploma can show up and get the same job as a black woman with a bachelor's degree.
Mhm.
Exact same job.
Yeah.
Yesterday was equal pay day, and we know what the data says about where women fall in terms of for every dollar that a man earns. Right, it's about 70 cents for white women. Then you get down to about 50 cents for black women. So we know that becoming the most educated demographic in society is almost like a necessity for our survival and for our abilities to take care of ourselves and maintain our households. Some of us, we may want to go back and get these extra degrees, but for some of us, we recognize that we need all of those additional letters behind our name just to be able to earn a decent living in this country. And the other side of that, though, is that when we look at like student loan debt and what that means for black families and for black women, yeah, we go to college, we get the degrees, but we're also saddled with this debt. But we did all of that just to be able to earn a decent salary, to have a comfortable lifestyle. So yeah, so that is that's the ugly side of that trend that we don't have enough conversations about. It's almost like it's a matter of necessity, not necessarily because we want to spend 12 years in college.
Indeed, indeed, and that's what needs to be discussed, right? Uh, I mean, because it's like you said, so much going on, right? It's like competing against that, the welfare or the ghetto queen, the hood rat narrative. So it's debunking that, but then it's this other reality that no one's discussing of, how it's something that can be celebrated in one extent, but it's also a cycle that keeps what many of us would call working poverty, uh,
Hmm.
or people with black women with this superb education but barely scraping together a middle class existence.
Right.
Partially because they're saddled with this debt, as well. So and do you I don't know if you know this, so it's unfair for me to ask. But do you know what is the number one employer sector that employs black women? Meaning, is it the private sector, NGO sector, or government sector?
I am not sure. I don't have the actual data on that, but just anecdotally, if I just think about like where I know like a lot of black women are employed, it tends to be in NGOs. Why? Because they get that sense of fulfillment that I can earn a salary while still fighting for these issues that impact the other people in my community. So we do see a lot of anecdotally, we do see a lot of black women kind of gravitate toward nonprofit organizations that give them a sense of fulfillment while also giving them like a decent salary, so they can build a comfortable lifestyle and still fight for and advocate for a lot of the issues that they are passionate about and the issues that impact and have a direct impact on their communities.
Indeed, and I think you will be close to right, or maybe it'll be a toss up between government sector and the public sector and NGOs. Because I just think about all the years that I've been at a university, with gaps in between, but basically since I was 18 years old. And I just see so many black women who are social work majors, education majors, and of course, and then right underneath there, healthcare.
Hmm.
And then of course you got all over, much more majors. But like I see the vast majority. So when I go to commencements, right, and you and I as professors, we attend a lot of commencements. Uh, and we see when they get the name and names with the majors, right, based upon the college that they're coming in. So the College of Social Work's turning, you see,
Hmm.
oh, that's where all the sisters were at, and indeed. And the reason I ask that, because, right, those types of things impacts policy, or what type of policies they're interested in. You know, right? If you have a party that's talking about shrinking the government and cutting government jobs, for example, right? A segment of society where it'd be like, well, you know, that's my employer and I'm doing good work helping people, and they want to cut it. So, you know, I'm opposed to that party, right? You know, and I bring that up because, you know, people aren't talking enough, and you've mentioned it before, about the reasons why
Mm-hmm.
we vote the way we, excuse me, the way we vote, right? We just talk about the outcome, but not the whys, right? And do you see more scholarship coming? Is that the type of scholarship that political scientists, black political scientists, black women political scientists are refocusing on now?
Yeah, I do see a trend within the discipline where more Black women are engaged in scholarly research with regards to those questions about like the why. But I also see more research about like the motivations for women's engagement in certain issues, like what motivates women to engage in healthcare advocacy, for example. We're also seeing where um, more women are looking at issues with regards to even the pedagogy side of political science. Like, why is it that not just Black women, but Black political scientists in general are more interested in being like scholar activists? So it's not just enough for us to engage within the ivory tower, but how do we take our work outside of the ivory tower? And also, how do we make our work and our research accessible to the everyday person? So there is another trend in the discipline where we're starting to have more open access journals. And the point of us having more open access journals is that we do this research and we involve and engage these communities in our research, but then our research is published behind these journals with these paywalls that the community that we research can't even afford to access. So making sure that the community has access to our scholarship and our research so that it's not just building another theoretical framework. How applicable is this research? Because if I go and interview someone about their motivations for healthcare advocacy, they don't want to just have their story hidden in a journal that people outside of the academy won't even look at, but they want to know, well, how applicable is this to the advocacy efforts that I'm engaged in, right? So we are seeing a trend where we're having more access to our research and making sure that our research is not just theoretical, but that there is also an applicable, like how applicable is our research and our findings to the everyday life of the people and the subjects that we're researching.
Indeed, and that's the thrust of what, you know, Black studies, and that's why political science, along with history and literature, are the key appendages to Black studies. You know, they are part of the skeleton, right? Is because of
Mhm.
that scholar activist, that emphasis on praxis,
Right.
right, and then access, and I think that is probably for me one of the most frustrating things about the academy and to our and concerning our colleagues. Far too many Black scholars, Black academics hide on college campuses, in my opinion, to be honest. And they're doing great research, and they can write great prose, so they can present their research results very eloquently,
Hmm.
but no one's reading it, right? And then you have a lot of public intellectuals, but they frame things and use these $8 words that if my mother don't understand it, I always ask, and I think about that when I'm speaking and when I write. If my mama don't understand what I'm saying, who am I talking to?
Right.
You know, and I'm going to be quite honest. I think for the most part, this is my observations. I haven't taken a survey or a poll, but I would say this is a loose participant observation that Black men are more inclined to be that than Black women. And I see it how Black women scholars interact with the community, how they create communities. I think that is probably the most powerful thing I've seen Black women academics do: create communities, and they sustain those communities, and they engage those communities. And I think that in that regard, Black women are the model, and Black male scholars, we need to follow suit. We need to observe what you all are doing to support one another and apply that to ourselves, because Black men, it's ironic and all because so many of us are involved in these organizations, but Black men scholars are probably the most disorganized demographic in academia, to be quite honest with you. We are very disorganized, right? But Black women, you guys organize yourselves, you know what I'm saying? And we tend to be more reactionary, and you all tend to be more forward thinking in that regard. So kudos to the Black women scholars, to you and the other sister scholars for that. Now we gonna wind down and wrap it up. So I'm gonna give you an opportunity to bring up, discuss, mention anything that you feel is important that we might not have touched on.
The only thing that I think that I would bring up, and it's kind of been like the theme for our discussion. I don't know who's in our audience, but I would encourage academics, researchers, scholars to make sure that as you do research, because this is my thing, right? And I know that it's my thing because it's me, it's personal to me, but to always ask and center the, not necessarily center, but make sure you include the Black woman perspective when you're doing research or when you're having these discussions, particularly about politics and about how politics impacts the Black community. You can't have that conversation if you don't include a piece of the discussion about Black women. One of my approaches to research is that I always want to center the Black woman
Mm-hmm.
and center the Black woman's narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that that is a perspective and that is a narrative that needs to be elevated, and the contributions to Black women, to political organizing and to social movement organizing. I don't think that that has gotten the level of um, examination or elevation from certain scholarly circles as it deserves. So yeah, so that is it. Just don't just thank Black women, include us in your research,
Mm-hmm.
vote for us when we run for office, elevate our stories, and make sure that our narratives are a part of any conversation about the Black political experience in America.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I want to thank you again, and I am so pleased that you decided to join us. Someone has a hand raised. You got to drop your question in the chat, Mr. Craig, or your comment in the chat, or the Q&A. All right, we'll see if Mr. Craig puts it in there. But I just want to personally thank you again. Uh, it's exciting times, it's scary times, and it's also a lot of great opportunities for researchers, scholars, and practitioners right
Mhm.
now. And so I know you could have been doing anything else, like reading or writing or grading, and all the things I need to be doing myself. But so I sincerely appreciate you speaking with us. And on behalf of everybody here in the Western Carolina community, in the Cullowhee, North Carolina, Jackson County community, thank you so much. And it was certainly our pleasure. All right, looks like he did put his question in the Q&A. Uh, well, she's Dr. Moore, Craig, Mr. Craig, but he asks, will Dr. Moore run for office?
That is a question that I get asked a lot. And right now, I don't necessarily see that in my future. And there are a number of reasons why I say I don't necessarily see that in my future. We talked a little bit earlier about like some of the shifts in terms of like the understanding of like the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, and some of that history has been lost on some of the people here in Lowndes County. So if I did, I probably would not run locally for anything county level, because I do think that I would have a very difficult time getting elected, depending on like the position. Because here's my thing. I have my own like political persuasions, right? I have the things that I don't compromise on.
Yes.
And I'm not even willing to compromise on those things to get elected to office. So I do think that when people ask me like, will you run for office? They don't know what they're asking for real.
Yeah.
And so I do think that people have to understand what they're asking for, because there are certain things that I'm not going to compromise on. I'm not going to compromise on the fact that I'm going to always have a focus and a center on Black community in the Black experience. I'm not willing to compromise on like my leanings on some social policy issues, and I recognize that I'm probably a little bit more to the left of the political spectrum than some other people. So I think once people really hear where I stand on certain, particularly social issues, they may reconsider whether or not they this is what they really want. So that is one of my hesitations. And also, I think that in terms of like state level office, a lot has changed in Alabama over the last few years. The presence of Democrats being elected to state level office in this state has declined significantly. So it's hard for someone who doesn't identify as conservative to win a statewide office. And I do not identify as a conservative. And I'm not willing to even like fake position myself on that side of the political spectrum just to get elected. I will, however, continue to make sure that people understand the political process. People understand what it means to be engaged after election day. I will continue to help people register to vote if they need that, explain ballot measures, ballot initiatives. I will do all of that in terms of voter education. But I do think that right now, I probably would serve my community better outside of traditional politics. So right now, the answer is no.
Indeed. And I definitely understand your perspective. I feel the only way I personally will run for office is if I retired from Western Carolina and moved back to Romulus, Michigan, and then I would run for Romulus Community School Board. That's about it.
Now, if I did, I definitely would definitely consider school board. But even here in Alabama, we have a double dipping ban, and because I work for a public institution, I
Indeed.
can't also serve on a state level in a state level office. So if I wanted to even run for like state legislature or state representative, state senate, I would have to give up my day job, and I'm not ready or willing to give up my day job. So state level, that is the issue with running for state office. County level, if there's anything, it would probably be school board, because I definitely would like to change some things with the delivery of public education here locally. And I do think that like the Bloody Lounge experience needs to be a part of the curriculum locally, and it is not currently the case. So yeah, I definitely would see myself on the school board, if anything.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, that sounds like a good, hopeful note to end on. So thank you again, and y'all stay safe down there.
Thank you so much. Enjoy.
Awesome. Goodbye, everybody.